When World War II ended in 1945, the victors wrote histories that clarified who had been righteous and who had been evil. The narrative became clean. Democracy had defeated fascism. Freedom had overcome tyranny. The soldiers who returned home were told they had fought the good war, and most of them stayed silent about what that war had actually required them to do. The silence was not accidental. It was enforced by military censorship, by social expectation, by the need to rebuild nations that could not afford to examine what their armies had done in the dark. The men who survived carried memories that would never fit into the stories their countries wanted to tell. And so those memories were buried, not in graveyards, but in filing cabinets marked classified, in letters that never reached families, in photographs that were destroyed before they could be developed. What remains is not a story of heroes and villains. What remains is a record of systems that transformed ordinary men into instruments of methodical violence and then demanded they never speak of it. The first reality that soldiers were forbidden to describe was how quickly killing became a job. In training camps across America, Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, young men were taught to think of combat as a series of tasks. Load the rifle, aim at the target, squeeze the trigger, clean the weapon, repeat. The language used by instructors was deliberately emptied of emotion. Enemies were not called human beings. They were called targets, hostiles, objectives. The transformation happened in stages. At first, recruits hesitated. They flinched. They aimed high or wide, unconsciously trying to miss. But armies had learned from the previous war that hesitation was inefficient, so they developed new methods. They used silhouettes that looked like men. They rewarded speed and accuracy with praise and privilege. They punished slowness with humiliation. And within weeks, the hesitation disappeared. Soldiers learned to fire without thinking, to follow orders without questioning, to see the enemy not as individuals, but as problems to be solved. By the time they reached the battlefield, killing had become as routine as marching or eating. And when they came home, they were told to describe their service as heroic, never as habitual. The second reality was that armies on all sides engaged in looting on a scale that would have been called theft in any other context. When soldiers entered towns, whether they were liberators or conquerors, they took what they wanted. Watches, jewelry, silverware, paintings, bicycles, clothing, food, alcohol. The official term was requisitioning, and it was technically legal under military law if done for strategic purposes. But the line between requisition and robbery was never clear. In practice, it disappeared entirely. American soldiers mailed home German cameras and Nazi daggers as souvenirs. Soviet troops stripped entire factories of machinery and shipped it eastward. British forces confiscated art and called it preservation. German soldiers sent home crates of goods taken from occupied France, Poland, and the Soviet Union. Japanese soldiers emptied warehouses in China and Southeast Asia. The looting was so widespread that it became an expected part of occupation. Officers participated, supply sergeants facilitated it, and military postal services processed the packages without question. After the war, no one was prosecuted for this unless the theft was from fellow soldiers or officers. Theft from civilians was filed under the acceptable costs of war. Soldiers who mentioned it in letters home had those letters censored or destroyed. The third reality was the widespread use of stimulants to keep soldiers functional beyond the limits of human endurance. Amphetamines were issued as standard equipment. The German military distributed methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin to tank crews, pilots, and infantry. Millions of tablets were manufactured and handed out like rations. The drug allowed soldiers to stay awake for days, to march longer, to fight without rest. The side effects were well known: aggression, paranoia, cardiovascular collapse, addiction. But the military priority was operational efficiency, not long-term health. The Japanese military used a similar compound called philopon. American forces issued benzodrine to bomber crews and infantry facing prolonged combat. British troops received amphetamines before major operations. The drugs were not hidden. They were part of the logistical system, documented in supply records and medical reports. But after the war, the public was never told how many soldiers had been chemically sustained through battles they would not have survived otherwise. The veterans who became addicted were left to manage withdrawal on their own. The phrase combat fatigue covered a wide range of conditions, including dependencies that began with orders from a superior officer. The fourth reality was that surrender was often not accepted. The rules of war, codified in the Geneva Conventions, required that soldiers who surrendered be taken as prisoners and treated humanely. In practice, this rule was ignored with such frequency that its violation became tactically normalized. On the Eastern Front, German and Soviet forces rarely took prisoners during the first years of the war. Captured soldiers were shot in ditches, in forests, in the basements of occupied buildings. The justifications varied. No resources to guard them, no time to process them, retaliation for previous atrocities, orders from above. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was disgrace, and so they fought to the death. American forces learned quickly that offering quarter was often pointless, and in some units, it became standard practice to kill rather than capture. There were documented cases of prisoners being executed after interrogation, of wounded enemy soldiers being finished off rather than treated, of men shot while waving white flags. These incidents were not always the result of rage or revenge. Often they were decisions made calmly, based on logistical convenience. After the war, some of these killings were investigated, but prosecutions were rare. The argument was always the same. The chaos of combat made it impossible to judge decisions made under fire, and so the men who refused surrender, and the men who were killed trying to surrender, disappeared into the category of unfortunate necessities. The fifth reality was that medics and medical personnel were targeted deliberately, despite the protected status granted to them under international law. The red cross on a helmet or armband was supposed to signal neutrality. It was supposed to mean that the person wearing it was there to save lives, not take them. But on battlefields across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, medics were shot on sight by snipers who understood that killing the man who could stop bleeding was as effective as killing 3 soldiers. German snipers targeted Soviet medics. Japanese soldiers fired on American corpsmen. Allied forces killed Axis medical staff. The reasoning was tactical. A wounded soldier removed one man from combat. A wounded soldier without a medic removed several because others had to stop fighting to carry him. Medics learned to remove their armbands. They learned to move at night, to work in craters, to carry weapons despite the rules forbidding it. Some stopped identifying themselves entirely. After the war, this targeting was not discussed in official histories. Medical units reported casualties, but the circumstances were left vague. The men who had worn the Red Cross and survived did not talk about it, because to admit that the symbol had made them a target was to admit that the war had no rules at all. The sixth reality was that friendly fire killed thousands of soldiers, and the numbers were suppressed to avoid damaging morale. Artillery shells fell short and obliterated advancing infantry. Bombers missed their targets and destroyed Allied positions. Naval guns fired on landing craft. Tank crews mistook friendly vehicles for enemy armor and opened fire. In the confusion of battle, identification was often impossible. Smoke, dust, darkness, panic, and the speed of combat created conditions where mistakes were inevitable. But the scale of these mistakes was never disclosed. Families were told their sons had been killed in action, which was technically true, but the action was often a miscalculation by their own side. The military kept separate records of friendly fire incidents, and those records were classified. Investigations were conducted quietly. Officers were rarely punished unless the error was catastrophic and public. The doctrine was clear. Admitting the frequency of friendly fire would undermine confidence in command decisions, and confidence in wartime mattered more than honesty. The soldiers who survived these incidents were often ordered not to discuss them. Letters mentioning friendly fire were censored. After the war, veterans who tried to talk about it were discouraged, told they were misremembering or accused of dishonoring the dead. The seventh reality was the systematic use of torture during interrogations, conducted not by rogue individuals but by trained intelligence officers following approved methods. Prisoners of war were subjected to beatings, stress positions, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, exposure to extreme temperatures, and psychological manipulation. The purpose was to extract information quickly, and the assumption was that speed justified brutality. Every major power engaged in this. The Gestapo and SS were notorious, but they were not alone. Soviet NKVD interrogators used methods that left prisoners permanently damaged. Japanese Kempeitai units tortured captured soldiers and civilians with bureaucratic thoroughness. British intelligence services employed techniques that were later described as enhanced interrogation. American forces used what they called rigorous questioning. The methods were documented in training manuals. Officers were instructed on how far they could go without leaving evidence that would be visible in photographs. The line was drawn not at morality, but at plausible deniability. After the war, some interrogators were prosecuted, but only those on the losing side. The victors classified their own records, and the men who had conducted the interrogations returned to civilian life without ever facing legal consequences. The prisoners who survived rarely spoke about what had been done to them, because to do so was to relive it, and because they knew no one would be held accountable. The eighth reality was that rape was used as a weapon of war by soldiers from every army, and the institutions that commanded those soldiers did almost nothing to stop it. When the Red Army advanced into Germany, Soviet soldiers assaulted an estimated 2 million women. The scale was so vast that it could not be hidden, but it was not prosecuted. Soviet leadership dismissed reports as fascist propaganda or justified the violence as retaliation for what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. German soldiers raped their way through Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, often with the encouragement of officers who framed it as racial conquest. Japanese forces established systems of sexual slavery, forcing tens of thousands of women into brothels misleadingly called comfort stations. These were not random acts by undisciplined men. They were organized, supplied, and regulated by military authorities. American, British, and French forces also committed rapes, though on a smaller scale and with less institutional support. In occupied France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, soldiers assaulted women, and the incidents were handled quietly, if at all. Courts-martial were rare, convictions were rarer. The priority was maintaining the image of the liberating army, and that image did not include the reality of sexual violence. Victims were silenced by shame, by fear, and by the knowledge that justice was not available to them. After the war, the stories were buried under the narrative of victory, and the men who committed these acts returned home as heroes. The ninth reality was that concentration camp liberators were not prepared for what they found, and some of them responded with executions. When American, British, and Soviet forces reached the camps, they encountered scenes that defied comprehension. Thousands of emaciated bodies stacked like firewood, survivors who looked like skeletons, barely able to stand. Guards who had been running the machinery of extermination days before, now trying to surrender. Some soldiers, confronted with this, shot the guards on sight. Others forced them into the crematoria and locked the doors. Some handed weapons to the prisoners and let them take revenge. These killings were not officially sanctioned, but they were rarely punished. Officers looked the other way. Reports were vague. The justification was that the guards deserved it, that they had forfeited their right to due process. And in the immediate aftermath, with the evidence of atrocity all around, few were inclined to argue. But these executions violated the laws of war. They were summary judgments carried out without trial, and they set a precedent that justice could be abandoned when emotions ran high enough. The soldiers who participated were never prosecuted. The incidents were mentioned briefly in some memoirs, then forgotten. The focus shifted to the crimes of the camps themselves, and the response of the liberators became a footnote. The 10th reality was that the firebombing of cities was designed to kill civilians, and everyone involved knew it. The strategic bombing campaigns carried out by the Allies were framed as attacks on military and industrial targets, but the reality was that entire cities were being incinerated. The firebombing of Dresden killed tens of thousands in a single night. Hamburg was turned into an inferno. Tokyo burned so hot that canals boiled. The bombers dropped incendiaries designed to start fires that would spread uncontrollably through residential neighborhoods. The goal was not precision. The goal was to create firestorms that would consume everything. The air crews were briefed on the expected civilian casualties. The planners calculated how many homes would burn, how many people would die. The numbers were written down in reports that were filed and classified. The public was told that these raids were crippling the enemy's ability to make war, and to some extent that was true, but the primary effect was terror. The campaigns were meant to break morale, to make the population demand surrender. After the war, the architects of these bombings were celebrated, not prosecuted. The pilots who flew the missions were honored. The ethical questions were set aside under the logic that total war required total measures, and the civilians who burned to death in their homes were counted as collateral damage, a term that made their deaths sound like an accident rather than a strategy. The 11th reality was that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not simply weapons of last resort, but demonstrations intended to shape the post-war world. The decision to use them has been debated endlessly, but the internal discussions make it clear that the calculus was not purely about ending the war with Japan. The Soviet Union was preparing to invade Japanese-held territory, and American leadership wanted to conclude the Pacific War before Soviet influence could expand further. The bombs were also a message. They were proof of technological supremacy, a warning to any future rival about what the United States could do. The cities were chosen not only for their military value, but for their suitability as test sites. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been left relatively untouched by earlier bombing raids, which meant the effects of the atomic weapons could be measured clearly. The destruction was documented by cameras and scientists who arrived shortly after. The deaths were counted and categorized. The burns, the radiation sickness, the long-term cancers, all of it was studied. The soldiers who witnessed the bombings were told not to discuss what they had seen. Photographs were classified. Reports on radiation effects were restricted. The public narrative focused on the bombs as a necessary evil that saved lives by preventing an invasion. The calculation assumed Japanese casualties did not count the same as American ones, and the people who died in those two cities became data points in the development of nuclear strategy. The 12th reality was that prisoners of war were used as forced labor by all sides, in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions. German prisoners worked in American and British factories, on farms, in mines. Soviet prisoners were worked to death in German labor camps. Japanese prisoners built roads and infrastructure under Allied supervision. The work was often dangerous, sometimes lethal, and always unpaid. The justification was economic necessity. Nations at war needed labor, and prisoners were available. The conditions varied, but the principle was the same. Prisoners were property of the state that captured them, and that state could use them as it saw fit. Some died from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from accidents that were not really accidents. The numbers were not publicized. After the war, there were some trials for the worst abuses, but the system itself was never condemned. Forced labor was reframed as contribution to reconstruction, and the prisoners who survived were sent home with no compensation. The companies that benefited from their labor continued operating. The governments that organized the system moved on, and the men who had been worked like animals were expected to be grateful they had survived. The 13th reality was that soldiers suffering from psychological trauma were treated as cowards and punished rather than helped. Shell shock, combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, the terms changed, but the response did not. Men who broke down under the strain of combat were removed from the front line, but not to be cared for. They were interrogated to determine if they were malingering. If an officer decided the breakdown was genuine, the soldier might be sent to a rest area for a few days, then returned to combat. If the breakdown was judged to be cowardice, the soldier could be court-martialed. Some were executed for desertion, others were imprisoned. The understanding of trauma was limited, and the priority was maintaining unit cohesion. A soldier who admitted he could not continue was a threat to the morale of those around him. So the message was clear. You do not break. You do not stop. You do not ask to leave. The methods used to enforce this were harsh. Public humiliation, reassignment to punishment details. In some cases, physical violence from officers or fellow soldiers. The men who could not adapt, who could not suppress their fear or their horror, were discarded. After the war, many of them were left with conditions that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the time, they were simply considered weak. They received no treatment, no benefits, no recognition. They lived with nightmares and flashbacks and the knowledge that their own army had seen them as failures. The 14th reality was that chemical and biological weapons were stockpiled and prepared for use by multiple nations, even though their use was banned. The First World War had demonstrated the horror of gas warfare, and treaties were signed to prevent it from happening again. But during the Second World War, every major power maintained chemical weapons programs. Mustard gas, phosgene, nerve agents. The weapons were manufactured, loaded into shells and bombs, and stored in depots ready for deployment. The strategic calculation was clear. If the enemy used gas, retaliation would be immediate. The doctrine was deterrence, but the weapons were real, and the plans for their use were detailed. Japan used chemical and biological weapons in China, deploying agents that caused excruciating deaths. Unit 731 conducted experiments on prisoners, testing diseases and toxins to determine their effectiveness. The results were documented with scientific precision, and after the war, the data was handed over to American authorities in exchange for immunity. The researchers were never prosecuted. The Allied powers chose information over justice, and the victims, thousands of them, died in experiments that were designed not to heal, but to weaponize suffering. The 15th reality was that food was deliberately withheld from occupied populations as a method of control, leading to engineered famines that killed millions. The Nazis implemented starvation policies in the Soviet Union, planning to seize grain and livestock to feed German forces and civilians while letting the local population die. The result was famine on a massive scale. In Greece, the German occupation caused a famine that killed hundreds of thousands. In the Netherlands, the hunger winter of 1944 killed over 20,000 people after German forces blocked food supplies in retaliation for resistance activities. The Japanese occupation of Indochina caused a famine in Vietnam that killed an estimated 2 million people. Food was diverted to Japanese troops and exported to Japan, while the Vietnamese starved. These were not accidental shortages. They were policy decisions, calculated and implemented by administrators who understood exactly what would happen. The starvation served multiple purposes. It weakened resistance. It freed up resources for the occupying army. It reduced the population that would need to be controlled. The people who died were not killed by bullets or bombs, but by spreadsheets and requisition orders. After the war, some officials were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, but many were not. The famines were attributed to the chaos of war, as if they had not been organized with bureaucratic efficiency. The 16th reality was that indigenous and colonial troops were used as expendable forces, sent into the most dangerous operations with inferior equipment and less support. The British Empire deployed soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean. France used troops from its African colonies. The soldiers fought bravely, often with distinction, but they were not treated as equals. They were paid less than white soldiers. They received older weapons. They were assigned to the worst positions, and when they were killed, their deaths were noted in separate casualty reports, as if they belonged to a different category of human being. After the war, these soldiers returned home expecting recognition and reform. Instead, they found that the empires they had fought for had no intention of granting them equality. Promises of independence were delayed or broken. Veterans were denied the same benefits given to white soldiers. In some cases, they were met with violence when they tried to assert their rights. The contributions of colonial troops were minimized in official histories. Monuments were built that did not include their names, and the narrative of the war remained centered on Europe and America, as if the millions of non-white soldiers had been irrelevant. The 17th reality was that many war criminals were never prosecuted because they were useful to the victors. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials were public spectacles, carefully managed to demonstrate that justice was being served. But behind the scenes, intelligence agencies were recruiting. Scientists who had worked on rockets and jets were brought to America and the Soviet Union. Doctors who had conducted experiments were given new identities. Spies and collaborators were put on payrolls. The logic was pragmatic. The Cold War was beginning, and the priority was not morality but advantage. If a man had skills or knowledge that could be exploited, his past could be overlooked. Some of the people who escaped justice went on to have long careers in government, in industry, in academia. They lived comfortably, respected in their fields, and they never faced consequences for what they had done during the war. The institutions that protected them justified it as strategic necessity, and the victims were told that justice had been served, even as the men responsible for their suffering walked free. The 18th reality was that the war did not end with clear moral resolution, but with exhaustion and expedience. The institutions that had enabled atrocity, the bureaucracies that had organized mass death, the command structures that had turned killing into routine work, all of them continued into peacetime. Officers who had ordered massacres retired with honors. Factories that had run on slave labor retooled for civilian production. Intelligence agencies that had tortured prisoners became permanent parts of government. The men who had fought were told to move forward, to rebuild, to forget, and most of them did, because there was no other choice. The systems that had made the war possible were not dismantled. They were refined, renamed, and integrated into the institutions of the Cold War. The soldiers who had been forbidden to describe what they had seen carried that silence into old age. Some of them broke it near the end, in interviews or memoirs, trying to leave a record before it was too late. But by then, the official histories had been written, and the stories that contradicted those histories were dismissed as the confused recollections of old men. The war had been sorted into categories: the good, the evil, the necessary, the regrettable. And the truth, which was that all sides had committed acts that could not be justified, remained classified in archives that would not be opened for decades. The infrastructure of violence outlasted the war itself, embedded in the treaties and alliances that followed. The men who had operated the machinery of death were not uniquely monstrous. That was the lesson that could not be spoken. They were ordinary people who had been placed in systems that rewarded obedience and punished hesitation. The bureaucracy had done its job. The chain of command had held. The orders had been followed. And when the war ended, the paperwork was filed away, the evidence was restricted, and the machine waited for the next time it would be needed.